Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is bore. This is another verb that was suggested by the viewer Luis, and I just want to say a special thank you for sharing these great ideas so we can all keep learning more about English verbs. Now, let's take a moment and review some of the definitions or the ways that we use the verb bore. The first way you might encounter the verb bore means to make a hole in something, particularly if you're using a tool like a drill, something that revolves. Right? So, if you're someone who does a lot of construction work, maybe you work in that industry or that field, you might encounter this verb a little more frequently. A second way you might hear bore used means to hollow out a tube or a tunnel. Again, that idea of making a hole, so hollowing something out. A third way we can use bore means to make one's way through a crowd. So almost kind of like you're making a hole so that you're able to walk or pass through. A fourth and very different way to use the verb bore means to make someone feel weary and uninterested by tedious talking or dullness. So I had to say when I heard this request, I was like, oh, I hope it's not because I make people feel weary and uninterested with my tedious talking, which I know sometimes these videos end up a little bit long, but that is what our definition means. What we should know now, though, is that bore is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, you're going to drop the E because we have the vowel consonant E ending, and then we're going to add ing. That forms boring. The past tense and the participle forms of this verb can be made by just adding D, since this verb already ends in an E. Our base verb, bore, or, ends with a R sound, and R sounds are voiced. This means the ED ending is just going to make a D sound, and I'm not going to add an extra syllable when I say it. So the past tense and the participle forms should sound like this: bored, bored. Okay. Now, you might encounter a few phrasal verbs, so we'll take a moment to discuss some of those. The first you might see or hear is to bore into. This goes back to that first definition. So you're drilling into a particular thing or into a surface. An example of this: he bore a hole into the ground to install the fence post. Right? So using some kind of tool, maybe beyond just a shovel, right? He didn't dig a hole, but he used something in order to form the hole. A second way to use bore into means to look at someone with interest and intensity, right? So you might almost think about it. It's like someone is looking with such intensity. It's almost like it's making a hole in you. Everyone's eyes were boring into her as she began her solo. Right? So here, maybe we're talking about a performer, someone at a concert, right? And everyone is staring with great interest and intensity. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to bore through. This can mean to create a hole in some object or some type of material. An example of this: they bored through the wall in several places looking for the source of the leak. Right? Really, what this means is they created a number of holes. Bore through can also be used to talk about really penetrating someone's inner self or their emotions. An example of this: that therapist can bore through her patients with spot on observations. So maybe someone is pretending to be fine, to be okay, but really what this sentence is kind of meaning is this uh, per, professional is able to sort of get inside and get a deeper understanding of someone's true emotions. Now, let's continue using our verb of the day in a couple different verb tenses. Today, we'll practice the past perfect and the present progressive. Let's start with the past perfect. We use this verb tense to talk about completed actions. But what makes the past perfect a little different than just the simple past tense is that we are using the past perfect to stress that one action occurred before another action or before a certain period of time. So that first action is going to be the one that is in the past perfect verb tense form. To make past perfect sentences, we're going to follow the same pattern no matter what our subject is. So in the affirmative, we start with the subject, we use the past form of have, that's had, and then we use the participle form of the verb. Now let's look at an example. The company had bored through and broken the line, resulting in sewage flooding the basement. I'm very sorry that I have a kind of a gross example here for my first sentence, but we've got that bored through, so we can think about drilling a hole. If you don't know what sewage is, think human waste that has not been processed, not treated, right? So this is kind of a disgusting, again, a horrible sort of image of something maybe flowing in to someone else's basement. That had bored is telling us that was the first action that occurred. Now let's talk about making a negative past perfect sentence. To do that, we start with our subject, we use had not, and then the participle form of our verb. Here's another example. We hadn't bored all the way through despite our efforts, right? So here, kind of noting, right, this action hasn't been completed. Maybe even though it was intended to be completed. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the past perfect. To do that, start with had, then you're going to want to use your subject, and then the participle form of the verb. Here's another example. Had any animals bored a hole in the garage before this weekend? So again, pretty common to see before in our past perfect sentences. We're again wanting to know if this action had ever occurred before this time. Now let's move on and talk about sentences in the present progressive. In your classes, or if you're using other books to study English or watching other YouTube videos, you might hear teachers refer to this as the present continuous, and that's just fine. These two things mean exactly the same thing. We're talking about describing actions that are happening now or actions that are in progress during a time period that has not yet been completed. The reason I use present progressive is I think, or sometimes I just hope, that the two P's can help my students remember that they need two parts to make their verb. So you're going to be using a present form of be. This means we're going to have to pay attention to our subject because be has three forms in the present. And then progressive means the ing form of the verb. So let's take a look at an example sentence. The teacher is boring her students with long-winded tangents. Okay. Again, oh, I hope it isn't me that you're thinking of as you watch and think about this sentence. So the teacher's one person. So with he or she, we're going to use is. That's our form of be that matches. And here it kind of means like the teacher might have a particular lesson, but then starts to talk about something that isn't exactly on topic. It gets a little bit off topic. They're maybe thinking, oh, and don't forget about this, or oh, here's something else that was sort of interesting, but clearly the students don't find it interesting. Now let's talk about making negative present progressive sentences. Again, we have to pay attention to our subject. So if my subject is I'm going to use am not, and then that ing form the verb. Okay. But if my subject is he, she, or it, I'll use is not, and then the ing form the verb. And finally, if my subject is he, is you, we, or they, I'll use are, A-R-E, and then that ing form of the verb. Okay. Another example. The contractors aren't boring new holes for the electrical hookups, right? So they're not maybe making holes in the wall or in other structures. Finally, if you want to make a yes or no question in the present progressive, what you should do is start with your form of be, whichever form matches your subject. That subject comes next, and then that ing form of the verb. Here's another question. Am I boring you with these examples? Right? Going back to that fourth definition of our verb. Now, let's take a moment and talk about some words that are related to our verb bore. And the first word we're going to talk about is just the noun form of this word. When we use the noun bore, we could be referring to a person whose talk or maybe their behavior is rather dull or uninteresting. An example of how you might hear someone might say, "Oh, that speaker is such a bore," right? They're not excited to maybe hear this particular person speak. Another way to use bore as a noun can just be to refer to any sort of situation or thing that you find tedious. It's taking a long time, and again, it's not all that interesting or exciting. I thought that book was such a bore, right? And in fact, many times if people feel that way, they just stop reading, right? Because it's not making them want to turn the pages and finish the book. Another related word you might encounter is, sorry, this should be a noun. I have another typo there, I'm sorry. Borer, that could be a person or a thing that bores or makes holes or pierces things. An example of how I hear this used quite a lot is the emerald ash borer has been killing ash trees in Midwestern US states. So this is referring to a particular type of insect that is very harmful to a particular species of tree. And again, this is a really big problem in the area of the United States in which I live. So that borer is referring to the insect that makes holes and sort of makes its home in this particular kind of tree. Another word you might encounter is the noun boredom. So it's that state of feeling bored. Example of this. Some say boredom can actually help people become creative. Now, you might notice I haven't gone through the adjectives boring and bored because I thought you would know those already. So we're talking about things that are dull or describing something that is uninteresting. The thing to pay attention with those is remember we use the ed form of that adjective when we're describing a person that has the feeling. Okay? And you want to use the ing form of the adjective when we're talking about the thing or the person that causes the feeling, right? So that can be really important. And I have one more thing that some people may find a bit confusing. If you've been a regular viewer of these videos, a long time ago, I think it's almost a year now, I talked about the verb bear, and some people might remember that it is the past tense form of bore, sorry, is the past tense form of the verb bear. So that can be something else that gets a little bit confusing. When this video posts, I'll make sure that I link to that verb bear so you can see the different meanings and the different ways that gets used. But I hope this video has helped you feel a bit more confident in using the verb bore. Thanks again to Luis for suggesting this particular verb, and thank you all for watching. Have a great day.